I am ready when you are. Do you have any questions for me? You read the bio.
Good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. As it stands, rapid advancements in AI are reshaping the global economy by displacing millions of workers, concentrating wealth for technology owners, and undermining traditional pathways to economic stability. Automation threatens to erode economic security and human dignity. We strongly affirm that UBI is a necessary and just response to AI-driven disruption. Contention 1 framework. A. First, the most important value in today's debate is justice, which John Rawls defines in his work Justice as Fairness. Samuel Freeman writes, Justice as fairness is to be a fair and impartial point of view. In our reasoning about fundamental principles, we are to imagine the veil of ignorance. Parties are derived of all knowledge of their personal and social circumstances, and are assigned the task of choosing the conception of justice that best advances their interests. The most rational choice are two principles of justice. The first guarantees equal basic rights, and the second provides equality of education and employment opportunities, and it secures for all a minimum of income and wealth. B. Second, the measuring stick for the attainment of justice is equality. British journalist Neil Larson writes, "We want greater equality, not because people are equal, they clearly aren't, but we're equal in terms of our right to make the most of the attributes, dreams, and hopes we have. Equality allows for people to express their unique differences, to develop fully as human beings. Equality makes freedom real." C. AI automation is a risk for jobs, particularly among middle-skilled workers. According to Dermont 20, jobs that involve a high share of routine tasks are at a risk of automation, as computers can substitute work and repetitive task structures by following explicit rules. The upshot is not that technology change can lead to mass unemployment, but rather that the risk of unemployment or income loss is unequally distributed. It is particularly pronounced among middle school individuals and routine occupations. Most models of comparative political economy predict that this type of strong risk exposure creates a demand for non-market social insurance. Contention number 2, application of Rawls' theory. Rawls' theory of justice necessitates a society with a basic income. According to Bryan 93, any rational agent will choose two principles. Each person has an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties. Social and economic inequalities must be the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the basis of self-respect are to be distributed equally. Freedom and choice of occupation, income and wealth, the social basis of self-respect. Basic income can provide only the satisfactory definition of the least well-off group. The primary goods enjoyed by the group is maximized by basic income. There must be a full set of equal liberties, and there must be a fair equality of opportunity. Citizens of similar ability must have access to the same education and the same chance of getting similar jobs. Equality of opportunity for all jobs and education can be made fair by a universal basic income, allowing everyone to stay in education as long as they wished. Equality of opportunity pertaining to jobs means that there must be free choice of occupation against a background of diverse opportunities. Free choice of occupation implies that people should not have to work in any job that they would not freely choose. The best way to bring this about is to grant a basic income to all, sufficiently high to constitute a living wage. People would have the freedom to engage in activities not presently recognized or rewarded by the market. Basic income would be guaranteed, the maximum occupational freedom and opportunity. We start with equality as our baseline. The only way that we can have a minimally presumptuous social welfare policy is to grant an unconditional basic income to all. Maximizing the income of the least well-off becomes an easy task, maximizing the basic income. The market cannot be left to meet claims of need. Only basic income can be described as truly separate arrangements from the market. We can see the wealth part of Rawls' fourth primary good as demonstrated that citizens get some kind of unconditional income. Self-respect is best secured by a meaningful notion of equal citizenship, and that basic income can help to make equal citizenship meaningful. This stigma associated with selective welfare measures is damaging to the recipient's self-respect. And a universal basic income is essential to creating freedom and preserving the individual. Pisani 2022 states, it is necessary to first clarify the concept of alienation. Alienation is not understood in a naturalistic or essentialistic sense. Man's specificity lies in praxis. Those alienated mark the anchor points of capital with respect to wage labor, have fallen through to or undergone processes of radical evolution, especially in the digital economy. With individuals forced to face the challenge of the market alone, income constitutes the only source of survival for the individual. UBI opposes this function of essential subordination, recognizing the possibility of existing with dignity regardless of obtaining an income within the market. UBI, by receiving this link, constitutes the essential condition for the development of an unconditional freedom, allows individuals to more easily challenge power relations. UBI would make it possible to strengthen the individual's decision-making, removing them from absolute exposure to the market, empowering each individual to plan their existence freely. UBI can encourage forms of conflict oriented towards social justice. UBI rests on the assumption of the market action as a springboard for choice and institutional imagination. UBI connects all people to the means of subsistence without the necessity of owning the means of production, a guarantee of the right to existence. It's free from the blackmail of work, from the obligation to accept any condition in order to obtain the resources necessary for survival. UBI is a condition for self-determination. UBI is the most suitable mechanism in terms of favoring the lawless deployment of the freedom of decision-making, a fundamental requirement for unconditional freedom. It opens the way for deconstruction of any absolute order, allowing subjects the freedom to make decisions and take control of their own reality. UBI is the most appropriate way to guarantee the decision-making ability of the individual. In short, it empowers individuals to find spaces in a position of being blindly subjected to the course of history, opening a space for surplus in which everyone can freely challenge the future.
Are you open for cross?
Yep.
Okay. Time will begin now. Alright, so let's just go to your point on like labor alienation and that like
Sure.
adopting a UBI is gonna free people from this like blackmail of needing to work.
Sure.
So under your like policy analysis of how UBI is gonna work, is it gonna be providing people enough income that they don't actually have to enter the labor market?
Enough income where they can not be living in poverty.
Okay, like, but is it enough income where they're not living in poverty while working, or enough income where they don't have to work and they're not in poverty?
People will always have to work. Under UBI, it basically allows them to work a job that they want to work.
Okay, can you give me some more specifics about like how your UBI is actually going to be implemented? Because you give us like a very nice, well-read story of how UBI
Sure.
is like a good philosophy, but we don't get any like implications of how this is actually going to be playing out.
Yeah, sure. So what would your specific question be about implementation?
How much is UBI going to be? How are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, so the question isn't number one. Okay, let me put it this way. The question isn't can we afford a UBI, it's whether we can afford mass unemployment without a policy like UBI. AI-driven automation increases productivity, which assists in compensating wealth. UBI can be funded through several ways. Taxes on AI-driven corporate profit, automation taxes, or data monetization taxes. AI expands the total economic pie is the meaning that the taxable base of income expands.
Okay, just as a quick question,
Sure.
would you say the like philosophical foundations of why you think a UBI is good is it a prerequisite to adopt those philosophical beliefs before we implement a UBI, or are you hoping that implementing the UBI is going to change like the nature of how work and community and society is structured in the United States? Which comes first, UBI and then we change our values, or do our values change and then a UBI policy plan comes?
I think that question relies on the crux of changing values. Within this debate, the most important value is justice, and we're measuring that by equality.
Okay, so what we're gonna say is that right now, uniquely, like the United States does not operate under your philosophy of like Rawlsian-based justice, and the unique way we're going to implement a UBI is not going to have any of the positive implications that you are saying it's going to. So, like, first off, you said that people are going to be able to like move away from labor constraints. If we take the most like common UBI policy proposal, which is everybody gets paid $1,000 a month, how is this going to actually allow anybody in poverty to not work jobs that are currently alienating them?
Sure. So I would say the cost is relative to the size of the AI-driven economy. If AI is replacing labor, failing to redistribute leads to economic collapse. So if you run the numbers, it appears that shifting money from either welfare programs or raising taxes on corporations, whatever, more than happy to tell you about that. But sure, UBI is expensive, but economic collapse is even more expensive.
Okay.
So based on value, who cares about the expense when the resolution states should?
I guess, can you just like give me an exact number of how much UBI benefits someone's going to get from like wealth tax to these AI like firms? Is it $500 a month? Is it $1,000 a month?
It's whatever is needed to basically ensure people aren't below the poverty line.
Okay, but you can't just keep like skirting this number because like let's take $1,000 for example.
Sure.
If I'm given $1,000 a month for 12 months out of the year, am I gonna like in any valuable way if I'm living under the poverty line? going to be able to have more freedom in choosing the job I need to.
Not-
$12,000 is not enough to live on.
Okay, I'm not advocating for $12,000. We can advocate for an increased amount of money.
Okay, how much?
It
Because
doesn't,
the
whatever
more
the
increase that
property
you,
line would be above.
okay, but the, okay, like, okay, we can move on.
Okay.
Okay, so then you're saying that the UBI like benefits being distributed to people is going to be proportional to how much automation like income is happening in the current state of affairs. So does this rely on a wealth tax on these AI corporations functioning under a UBI plan?
Yeah, it could, is the short answer to yielding on.
Is everybody ready? Okay. You guys ready? Okay. Time will begin on my first word. Today, nearly 1/3 of Americans use social welfare programs. Now, this is not surprising, as the U.S. Census Bureau writes that these programs provide fundamental services to individuals that are impoverished or unable to work. Indeed, Arthur Altenmeyer of the Social Security Office states that these benefits are being expanded to include almost all workers and populations in need. A universal basic income places these programs at risk. Therefore, because UBI is a system that irreversibly entrenches the wealth gap through a one-size-fits-all policy, we are so proud to negate. Our sole contention is a cure worse than the disease. Before we get there, we believe that the frame should be a cost-benefit analysis, not the Rawlsian-based justice. Subpoint A is harming the most vulnerable. Universal basic income disproportionately affects those with low or modest incomes. As Robert Greenstein of CPPP writes, in 2019, UBI would replace the current welfare state with regressive funding, increasing poverty and inequality. This is harmful because the current welfare state lifts tens of millions of people out of poverty and supports upward mobility. Even eliminating it entirely would only fund a UBI of under $2,000 per year. Furthermore, John Hendrickson of Governing News explains in 2025 that UBI would place more pressure on already heavy tax burdens. It would also disincentivize people from searching for jobs and working, just as the COVID-19 stimulus checks caused many able-bodied individuals to stay out of the workforce. Graham Perkins from the University of Exeter continues in 2021 that UBI decreases the likelihood of workers joining organizations and unions because of weakening attraction and retention. This is disastrous, as Adam Dean from the Economic Policy Institute writes in 2024, that labor unions are uniquely powerful to stop democracy from declining, as a 1% rise in union density links to a 9.8% increase in ballot drop boxes, while declines in density lead to over 40% of these ballot boxes disappearing. If labor unions continue to decline, America's democracy is at risk. Subpoint B is technological elitism. UBI being praised as an amazing solution to AI displacement is a paradigm most often pushed by those in charge of the AI sector. As Jean Dupont of Simon Fraser University writes in 2025, AI tech leaders present UBI as a way to distribute the supposed benefits of AI, while in reality, these tech giants simply want to gain public acceptance for the omnipresence of AI. Pipon furthers that with open research conducted a pilot study of UBI programs from 2020 to 2023, and individuals who were given a stipend did not see improvements in employment quality, education, or overall health. Now, our impact is twofold. First is continued power abuses. Ben Tarnoff from The Guardian explains that AI tech elites that push for UBI only support it because the theory of technological inequality allows them to skimp off responsibility for creating scenarios that actively oppress workers. As Ahmad Shalabi from the Springer Nature continues in 2025, UBI is designed to entrench digital feudalism where monopolies are preserved and systemic reform is avoided. This not only means that UBI could lead to fewer people working, but that we would operate under the assumption that displacement is inevitable, which shuts down alternatives like human-AI collaboration. Second is global polarization. Jean Dupont explains that the idea of UBI weakens ethical accountability by shifting responsibility from developers to users and communities. As a result, its impacts stay largely within the United States, where AI is concentrated, excluding global populations by centering benefits in already advantaged countries. This deepens global north-south inequality and marginalizes billions who support AI systems. Subpoint C is economic deficit. As Robert Greenstein writes, $10,000 a year to 300 million Americans would cost more than $3 trillion annually, which is more than 75% of the entire federal budget. Even if we were to cut this in half to $5,000, it would still cost as much as the federal budget outside mandatory programs. Greenstein explains that this is unlikely to be covered through taxes as well, since most Americans don't owe federal tax or are in the lowest tax bracket. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget further corroborates that a value-added tax or VAT is also highly unlikely to mitigate the cost. 2020 Democratic candidate Andrew Yang claimed it would work at about half European typical rates, but that would fall short. Therefore, either the VAT would need to be much higher, the UBI reduced, or other funding added, which still likely wouldn't be enough. Even worse, the USFG is backed up against a wall. According to the Peterson Foundation, current debt is over $39 trillion and rising roughly $90,000 per second based on US GEC data. This is terrible, as Michael Townsend from Charles Schwab further corroborates in 2026 that the debt ceiling was pushed back from $3.84 trillion to $4.1 in June 2025, meaning the United States is just steps away from defaulting. Paul Winfrey of the Economic Policy Innovation Center writes in 2024 that the only way to reverse the debt spiral is if America reduced spending by $2.4 trillion, which is nearly impossible within the current trend of constantly running deficits. E.G. Antoni of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute continues that the Treasury has been borrowing at an annual rate double the projected amount, meaning that the government is unable to fund any additional expenses, much less a multi-trillion-dollar UBI. The impact is economic collapse, as implementing UBI would place America at risk of defaulting. This is disastrous, as Lisa Desjardins of PBS News writes in 2023 that social welfare programs would be the first to go and interest rates would skyrocket. Mo Mazic of the International Business Times furthers in 2026 that the US defaulting would erase trillions of dollars in days, and consumer confidence in global markets would collapse. Quickly to the AF flow. The main issue with their entire case is that they paint you a beautiful picture of what UBI could do in their affirmative world. We agree with, their philosophical concepts are great in, a vacuum, in a utopia. But what we tell you is that the way UBI is actually going to be implemented in the United States or many other countries is not going to conform to the principles they want. What they would like to tell you is that all of the new net revenue that's going to be used to pay for UBI is going to be coming from a wealth tax on AI, automation firms, like Elon Musk and Sam Altman. We say this is incredibly unlikely to happen in their world. We also tell you that the UBI costs that they're talking about aren't going to be enough to actually give people the amount of money needed to avoid labor alienation. People are still going to be impoverished. While welfare systems are going to be cut, this means that they're still going to be forced to work in the same conditions that they are already in.
Good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead and start. Thank you for that speech. I'm going to have a few questions naturally. So would you agree that large-scale AI automation will displace workers?
I think it totally depends on how the AI automation goes. I think it changes the job sector, but I think it depends on how it replaces people. People can move into different sectors depending on what kind of education they get. I think it will replace certain jobs in some sectors of the economy.
Okay. Would you agree that this displacement could happen faster than historical job transitions?
Yes, I believe it could happen faster.
Cool. So what specific jobs could absorb millions of displaced workers from AI automation?
I think we see that as unpredictable as the changes in the labor markets are, it's equally unpredictable what new jobs could necessarily take their place.
Okay, so if enough people lose jobs, how is income guaranteed from your point of view?
We think that the current welfare system is uniquely better than the universal basic income, because with your system it's regressive and people are going to be getting less benefits than they are in the status quo. Since you're not actually going to be able to pay for any of the benefits that you're talking about at the scale you're talking about, we're not going to see people less impoverished or with more flexibility. Although AI is going to probably hurt us under our current welfare system.
Okay.
Our entire contention is that UBI does a worse job at combating the problems you're talking about.
Cool. So the solution of welfare still depends on people having jobs, correct?
I think some welfare benefits in the status quo do require that you're employed, others do not.
So theoretically, what happens to consumer demand if large portions of the population lose income?
Yeah, so I think what the United States can do is either we can recognize and make small changes to our welfare system that allow people to receive more benefits while being unemployed. There are also current benefits in the status quo, a child tax credit that don't rely on your employment, which we can use as a basis or a foundation for reformatting some of our current welfare system.
But you would agree that if demand drops, businesses and total economic growth would suffer, correct?
Demand drops. businesses.
like consumer demand, if large portions of the population lose income.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so let's say, basically, another question of whether or not you agree. If AI increases productivity and wealth, do you agree that society will have more total resources?
Like I mean, what do you mean by resources? Like, are we gonna have more like data centers and things like that? Or are we gonna
Not
have more like physical
necessarily.
material resources?
Kind of like, think of it as like an economic pie. AI helps, right?
Well, I'm not necessarily, I'm not sure that it does. Like, I think
Okay.
the automation we've seen in the past has increased people's like material wealth, but AI automation is uniquely different. Like, it may be expanding the economic pie, but like the slice that's going to be effectively given to workers cannot come in like any meaningful forms.
Sure.
Because it's just like a redistribution of wealth, and we say it's going to
Right,
accumulate
so
in the
that's-
top hands under your universal basic income because it's uniquely regressive.
Right, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. So the issue is not scarcity, it's distribution, right?
Yeah, we would say so.
Okay, that is all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, 6 minutes, everyone good?
Yeah.
Cool. Just for a quick roadmap, I'll be going over the framework page, the application page on the app, and then our opponent's contentions in the order that they were presented. Starting off on the framework page, I want to point out a note in cross-sects that our opponents agree with our philosophical concepts and framework. This is critical because the question of the resolution is not what should the US do or how is the US going to implement XYZ policy. It is a specific question of what society should do. Right, which is an important distinction to be made, particularly because all of their evidence is in the context of both feasibility and the United States, meaning that they're not considering the entire question of the resolution. They also, on their contention, which I'll get to more later, talk about cost-benefit analysis, but absent any sort of justification for that framework or any ethical standard for you to measure that by, you should buy our specific evidence-based framework as to what society should do. Under an ideal world, how should society create justice for all of its citizens? We're not defending a specific policy position, number, or program, because that's not the question we're asked today. The resolution doesn't specify the United States. It doesn't specify a specific income number or a specific funding mechanism. It's grounded in the question of what a society should do. We believe that a society, to determine what it should do, should use Rawls' theory of justice by implementing a veil of ignorance to create a system that benefits the most people in the most ways. We think this should be framed through the question of what is just and equal, not what is feasible in the status quo. Absent any logical or ethical defense of their cost-benefit analysis, you shouldn't buy it just because that's where they wanted to do all their research and that's where they found the most flashy numbers. We'll tell you specifically how decisions should be made through the veil of ignorance, because the resolution isn't country-specific. It's grounded in the ethical question of justice. This debate is simply not about the need for feasibility or implementation of such a system. It's simply a question of whether or not this system should be implemented in the most ideal conception of society. Additionally, I think it's important to point out that they don't provide you an additional solution. All they say is that UBI is bad, that traditional welfare programs are sufficient, which I'll get to more, but they're not sufficient in the status quo. They certainly won't be sufficient when when there's mass layoff because of AI. The current welfare system punishes income earning and is already creating and has already created massive cycles of poverty, even without this AI automation. Because of that, you cannot buy the status quo as an effective solution, particularly as our job situation gets worse. And not for nothing, they're just kind of wrong about how UBI has been successful in the past. It's been successful in creating benefits for countries like Finland, Canada, Brazil, Kenya, etc. It's not a theoretical concept. It has been proven to be successful in many different places if you want to buy the feasibility arguments. But they also talk about how people in cross-sec specifically, how people can simply move into a different sector when they lose their jobs. But I'll direct you to our Dermot 20 evidence that specifically says that automation is a risk for mid-skill workers, meaning that to go into a new industry, they would have to find new skills, get retrained, get a different education. The only way to make that happen in either world is to implement a UBI sufficient enough that these people can focus on education or new training of skills instead of trying to focus on finding an income or finding a job. That's the conception of UBI that we defend a society should implement. They don't engage at all with Rawls' theory of justice or how that's actually implemented or how that engages with UBI, which should frame how you think about all of their arguments. They don't engage with the case page at all. Moving on to their conventions proper, again, they throw at you a lot of feasibility numbers about the US and our spending deficit. None of that matters in the context of A, the question of the resolution, nor the affirmative that we have presented for you. They specifically talk a lot about this technological exploitation and sort of the AI elitism that happens in the status quo. We totally agree that that's a thing happening. AI elites are defending UBI as a program, but that's because the conception of UBI they're defending is not the affirmative view. They believe in a UBI that the negative is talking about, where there's only a small subsidy that keeps people in poverty and creates a two-tiered society. Our conception is notably different because it provides a sufficient amount of income for a person to live without having to work, without having to constantly be searching for another job. That way they are freed from sort of the conception and the tyranny of labor and are able to focus on things, A, that bring them joy or bring their lives value. Things like education or skills retraining if they want to continue to have a job, but it's not necessary in the affirmative world, which is specifically why our version of UBI doesn't actually entrench this wealth gap. Because one of the main ways where the AI elites make their money and create their wealth is through the exploitation of the labor of the working class. Absent that labor, and if that labor is not coerced, they don't have that to exploit and they don't have that to work to their advantage, which is a massive benefit that the negative simply doesn't touch. They've not engaged with the sort of ideals behind the affirmative case, and in cross-ex, they said they agree with those ideals. So it's a little bit of a misconception situation because they don't actually understand A, what the resolution says, or B, what the affirmative says. We believe that it's beneficial to look at this resolution through a question of ethical justice and not through a question of conception or cost-benefit analysis. When they come up in their next speech and start talking about, oh, this is why we should evaluate through a cost-benefit analysis, you should be skeptical. They didn't have that justification in their first speech, and only because they're being pressed for it might they bring it up. When they do start talking about the costs and the benefits, you have to consider that the costs and the benefits of a society where people are not forced to work, where people have the ability to use their labor or use their time for other things that bring them personal benefit instead of creating capital, that's where we see the most benefits for a society and where we can determine what a society should do. The cost of this situation is completely irrelevant to the question of the resolution, which is why at the end of the debate, you're going to vote for it. I'm good for costs.
Thank you.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about like this. You say that there's like a precedent of UBI working in many different places. Can you give me like an example, just like one example where UBI has been implemented and is a policy that is happening right now?
Yeah, so Finland in particular, like sort of implemented a randomized experiment of UBI. I believe it was like 2,000 citizens, so it's obviously on a smaller scale, and it was a year or two.
Okay.
It didn't decrease employment, it improved well-being, lowered stress, decreased health
Okay,
problems.
how much money did they get?
I don't have that number.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's talk about like this like risk for the middle class. So what's your solvency, right? Like you say that like if we don't implement a UBI, then they get hollowed out. But like, how does a UBI uniquely position them to like go out and get like more jobs? Especially because you say that like UBI is going to be able to fund everyone and like they don't have to actually work. So what is their motivation for going out and finding a job?
Passion. Like they can have the ability and they're not forced to use their labor for things that they're not passionate about, right? So under our conception of UBI, we think it's most beneficial for everyone if they are able to work within what they want to do. So like my passion is probably different from your passion, but in a system of UBI, we can both do whatever we think is valuable with our time without being forced to consider, am I going to make enough money doing this to be able to support myself, my dependents, etc.
Okay, really quick follow-up to that. What job sectors would they go into? Like what passions would they follow?
The point is that they don't have to pick a job sector, so whatever job sector they want to go into. So like if I wanted to go be an artist, I could do that, even if it wasn't a lucrative career. Or if I wanted to go be an engineer, I could do that. despite it being
So basically what you're
traditionally
saying is that we're providing a baseline for everyone, but that still doesn't fundamentally change like how much like money they're gonna get from their jobs.
Sure, yeah, you're providing enough income to live on, so regardless of whether or not you are employed or have another source of income, you are able to
How
support
much money would you say people can live off of per year?
I mean, obviously, I think it depends on the person and it depends on the location. I think if I remember, the average is like $60,000, but the specific number isn't important to the affirmative case. That's not the question of the resolution.
Okay, well, so okay, then let's talk about like your philosophical framing. Like if you're saying that societies we like should do this or not, it's like a question of morality. But if when we look at whether a society should actually implement a UBI, shouldn't we also consider feasibility? Especially if all of the impacts from the issue of feasibility precipitates, and then we see that now we have a terrible society, we shouldn't have done this.
Yeah, so you're actually misinterpreting our framework. We think that what's the question of what society should do should not be framed through the lens of the status quo, but should be framed through the lens of creating an ideal society. That's why the veil of ignorance is so important. If you know nothing of your circumstances, nothing of the circumstances of those around you, and you're only tasked to create an ideal version of society, we think you'll arrive at a couple of principles. Equality is one of them.
Okay. Wait, so just to clarify, you're like evaluating this through the lens of an ideal society, or trying to achieve an ideal society.
Yeah, that's the framework page, and also it's just the question of the resolution.
Okay, sure. But we're talking like they say societies, right? So societies probably implies that we're looking at the societies within the world.
Why should it imply that? It doesn't say the societies with the status quo. It doesn't say the United States. The resolution only says the word society.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about societies, but like let's say we're not necessarily exactly talking about just the U.S., but like we probably should consider societies that are like actually in the world rather than like this idealized version of a society.
I mean, you can say that, but you don't have a defense for that in your case, and
Because
if
that
you
was
do
our
it,
first
you're right.
speech, so we can still respond. But okay, that's gross. We don't have. Judge, the F paints you a really pretty picture, but we give you a clear photograph. We believe that should in the resolution fiat that a UBI comes, but not that we necessarily get to fiat the best UBI or that it is the UBI that we should use. It's just that we get some sort of UBI. They tell you that we're working towards an idealized society, but this is so silly. We need to look in terms of like the resolution should talks about societies in the real world because that is the world that we're living in. We can't create an ideal society, and that's not what we should be looking at because we should prefer societies that we are living in right now because those are the impacts that come to us right now. Next, we also tell you that like they give you absolutely no like reasoning or line of analysis as to how UBI is going to be implemented. Everything they tell you is purely ideological, as they told you in class. And this is like so super utopian. They don't consider anything else that comes with it. While we tell you that, and they might say, oh, we don't have to consider that because we're working towards an idealized society. But again, we tell you that if we are looking at the issue of implementing a UBI, we should also look at the adverse effects that could possibly come with implementing a UBI because that still dictates whether we should or should not implement a UBI. Okay, next, they tell you that the UBI would provide them enough income to not be living in poverty, but that is a situation where people are surviving rather than living. We tell you that it is infinitely better to live in a society where you can choose what you spend your money on and that you have the time and resources to find jobs, which UBI kills. Now let's talk specifically about like this number they throw out in class. They tell you that an average person probably can live off of $60,000 a year. However, as you look to our case, we tell you that even just giving someone $1,000 per month, which equates to $12,000 per year, one is below the poverty line, and two, people cannot reasonably live off of that. And like that overall would cost the USFG trillions of dollars, which is really, really bad. But let's specifically go down their case. Their entire case rests on the assumption that UBI inherently increases justice in society because we're working towards an idealized society. This is really wrong. Refer back to our 3 contentions. First, it harms the most vulnerable because we are taking welfare away from them. The average person gets around like $20,000 per year from social welfare, while UBI maximum will give them $12,000. Second is technological elitism. The AI elites are the ones that are pushing for this UBI because they know that then that means that people are just going to accept AI into their lives. There's going to be less dissent. There's going to be less protest against like the situations that actively oppress them. Third, economic deficit happens, which is like a perfectly reasonable thing to assume why we should not implement a UBI, because if economic deficit happens from us implementing a UBI, we shouldn't do it. It's just morally wrong because then we can see all of these trickle-down effects with trillions of dollars being lost, people losing their jobs, which is overall much, much worse than like if we stayed in the status quo and didn't change anything. Okay, next, Aft talks about how a UBI leads to people being able to work the jobs that they want. But let's assume that like their UBI, their idealized UBI, which probably wouldn't happen anyways, is actually what gets implemented. This would lead to less people working. Why is that? Because we've seen this with the COVID-19 stimulus checks. People decide to work based on income from working wages and the cost of working. And people only work when the benefit of working exceeds the benefit of not working. If people get a livable wage from UBI, that means there's not going to be any people working because they don't have to go out and work regardless of passion. If people genuinely just like wanted to pursue their passions, they probably would pursue it without any interest in actually getting money from it. The reason people work is so that they can get money, get an income, and actually contribute to the economy. This is really bad for a few key reasons. First, it decreases economic participation because less people working means less people going out and buying stuff. Second, it assumes that AI displacement is inevitable and people shouldn't protest against it because, again, like, oh, you can't actually protest anything. Next, with a UBI, because there's a guaranteed income, that increases the baseline for which people don't work, and it makes a lot of jobs less worth it, like customer service or restaurant work, and the income effect takes place. Next, they tell you about how UBI creates freedom and ability to protest. However, refer back to our case where we give you specific examples of labor union decline in the face of UBI. The reason people don't join unions is because unions form when workers need better wages or protections, and because like a UBI guarantees like a basic income, the pressure to organize becomes for survival becomes less immediate, which means that workers, rather than protesting for improved working conditions, they just hop from job to job, which is like reinforces the systemic issues within these bad working conditions, because employers don't have any incentives to actually change this. And that's really bad because when we see unions decline, we see democracy decline as well. We give you a really specific example in the 2022 midterm elections. When labor union density increased by 1%, that meant a 9.8% increase in ballot drop boxes also coming back. Why does this happen? It's because unions actively engage in civic communities and civic communication with other people because they give motivation for people to go out and change the world. UBI is also inherently bad because, like I said before, it reduces the amount of welfare that people get. Like, you would get like pretty much like a 50% cut to how many benefits you would get. And this is also extremely elitist because we are redistributing welfare and money that are specifically targeted to impoverished populations and redistributing it upward. This is a regressive policy that means that people who don't actually need UBI will get the benefits from UBI because again, it's universal, it's basic, it's guaranteed, which is inherently really bad for the people that are living in impoverished societies.
Okay, basic. Oh, okay. So I guess just first, when the judge signs the ballots, will it implement a UBI if he votes out? Like in the status quo right now?
Like, yeah. That's like we're operating under the assumption that if we were actually like policy debaters, then like.
Why are we operating under the assumption that this is a policy debate?
Debate functions as a space where we can like look at an issue, improve our education and knowledge on a topic, and then that means that we're educated to go out in society and actually understand how these policies shape our lives, not like some ideological state that we're living in.
Do you not need to have an understanding of like basic philosophy to function in society? Do you only need to know like plus or minus $100?
I mean, okay, so let's say probably someone having morality and ethics is like important, but we also say that that's like not the forefront of the issue. The forefront of the issue is whether like this cost benefit analysis actually works. Like if something pushes people into economic deficit, like that's
Yeah.
probably pretty bad and we shouldn't implement it.
Cool. So my next question, how much do you think a just society is worth? Like when does justice become too expensive under your world?
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so we are defending a view of a just society, a ideal world where we are treating each other justly, fairly, equally. In your world, you're talking about the cost of that. So when does that become too expensive of a policy to implement? What's the dollar
Yeah,
value?
we would actually say like probably right now, like if you look like let's assume the US is some ideal society. That doesn't erase the fact that we're like $39 trillion in debt and only $2 trillion away from it. And the UBI would like at its like
No, yeah,
minimum would
that's-
cost $3 trillion, which means that like
So
if we implemented this, then boom,
$3 trillion
economic
is the maximum amount you're willing to spend on a just society. Is that your answer? Because
No,
you
no,
didn't answer the question.
No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying like that's the minimum of a UBI, and that like even a minimum would push us into economic deficit, which is infinitely times worse than just staying in the status quo with where we have welfare systems that actually currently work.
Yeah, so let's talk about those welfare systems. You talk about people having the ability to choose what they spend their money on. Welfare systems are primarily in-kind benefits like housing vouchers. How does that give people autonomy of choice?
Okay, yeah, so here's the thing. This is like, you're kind of like misinterpreting what we're saying. So because the current welfare system gives targeted aid to people, that means that they don't have to worry about stuff like housing security, food benefits, like healthcare, stuff like
Yeah,
that.
okay.
So that means that whatever income that they get from their jobs, they can spend on whatever they want because they don't have to worry about like all of these like necessary things for survival. While like UBI just
Sure,
like, okay,
if that's the case,
erase
why are
all
people
of
still
those, give it to
homeless? Like, why do people still have housing insecurity, food insecurity, if the welfare system is so good at allowing people to stop worrying about that?
Yeah, because we would say that like, so the issue with that is that because like some people genuinely just like don't work. Like you can't guarantee that everyone wants to work. Like you can.
Why is that a problem? Why should everyone be forced to work?
We're not saying that it's a problem. We're saying that like this is like non-unique in both worlds. That in both worlds there are people that don't want to work. There's also people that do want to work. We just say on net we will benefit the most amount of people because we're the ones that actually want to work and improve their lives.
Just to
they will
clarify,
be
you
able
think
to
it's
because-
morally defensible that people who don't want to work should be forced to live in poverty? Do you think that's fine because they don't want to work?
No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that like social welfare helps them. Okay,
Okay, but in the situations where it's clearly not helping people, people are food insecure, housing insecure, regardless of whether or not they work, why is that a morally defensible stance to take?
Okay, you're also like kind of twisting like how society works. Like there are many cases of homeless people who choose to live homelessly. Like you can't change their mindset, and you shouldn't force them to change their mindset either. Like this is really silly.
Okay, but why is giving them an income a bad thing?
We're not saying it's a bad thing. We're saying that it diverts the resources that are targeted for impoverished populations upward, which is inherently a bad thing because it's elitist.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. And you have 2 minutes prep time if you need it.
Yeah, we'll take it.
All right.
two main arguments. One, that UBI is a level of AI elite power. Two, UBI doesn't solve enough or isn't feasible. Here's the problem. Our framework was never answered clearly. With our framework being justice as pluralism, fairness, with equality as the standard, that entire architecture is standing. When you evaluate every neg argument through that lens, they lose. They are offering you a world while we wait for structural revolution while people fall into poverty right now. We are offering a floor. Let's talk about it. With the AF case, the neg states we cannot create an ideal society. Why? If we accept this, then what is the point of anything? What is the point of debate? There's no point to debate, have this conference, or even talk about anything if we're not willing to work towards an ideal society. AF affirms that UBI is a mechanism for equality and working towards a better society. We provide a specific framework for how you should make decisions that center justice that the neg doesn't disagree. They concede and they agree with our philosophy in cross acts. We believe that under our framework, justice includes equal basic rights and freedoms. They say that people need to work and providing an income is bad because they won't contribute to the economy, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of welfare in society. It's not logically or morally defensible for people to live in poverty, without homes, without food, just because they don't want to work. It's completely bankrupt, and the more they dance around it, the more it's clear that it becomes that they put the U.S. budget over aiding human beings in any society. They say cost-benefit analysis, but provide no framework as to how that gets implemented or why it's the best POV from this debate under the resolution. We consider all parts of this resolution and have a specific decision-making framework for you to evaluate our arguments through. Their refusal to engage with our case on any other level than it would be too expensive. It becomes clear that they don't have a sufficient answer to any of it, which should influence your decision. Number two, with the neg case, both AI elite and economic deficit, neg says that people won't work, but under experiments, the amount of people that work under UBI does not change. When we're citing these instances of Canada, Finland, United States, etc., studies over and over have shown that UBI recipients are not less likely to work. And when it comes to economic deficit, couple answers here. Number one, we run deficits on military spending, tax cuts, and corporate subsidies without the same scrutiny. And number two, we're currently running $1 trillion deficit because of mandatory programs like Social Security. And number three, previous deficit spending during the New Deal and post-World War II era produced long-term growth. My point is that investing in people is not a waste. The fact that AI elites support UBI doesn't make UBI bad. That's like saying we shouldn't have child labor laws because some support them for self-serving reasons. And also, AI elite doesn't advocate for what we're advocating for. Now, when it comes to the neg rebuttal, specifically in the status quo, the current welfare system is structurally flawed because it distributes inequity and fails to meaningfully reduce poverty. Universal basic income is necessary to replace this broken system with one that is fair, consistent, and effective. Some programs, such as disability insurance, can force recipients into a binary choice. Either you work or receive the benefit. So, other than things being equal, someone who could keep his UBI would be more likely to see work than someone who loses all of it or some of it, other safety net benefits as a result. The federal government, just to illustrate this, currently funds 126 separate and often overlapping anti-poverty programs. For example, there are 33 housing programs run by 4 different cabinet departments. There are currently 21 different programs providing food or purchasing assistance. These programs are administered by 3 different federal departments, 8 different healthcare departments, administered by 5 separate agencies, 6 cabinet departments, and 5 independent agencies oversee 27 cash or general assistant programs. This is a lot to judge. All of this spending, in fact, has not grown or produced an appreciable reduction in poverty. The current welfare system traps people into a cycle where we're trying to improve their situation, and it can actually make them worse off. As long as the current welfare system exists, it continues to reinforce poverty and inequality. But UBI breaks that cycle by creating a system that actually promotes stability and opportunity. The application of a status quo welfare system is not defensible under a framework of justice and equality. It's not even cost effective or alleviates poverty in the status quo, and certainly won't get better when there are fewer job opportunities because of this and because of AI. And with all that in mind, it's kind of game over for neg. Now, when it comes to just a couple things to keep in mind as you sign your ballot today, Judge, I'd like to tie this debate up into a pretty little bow. Think Christmas. Number one, Rawls' framework is completely untouched and it justifies UBI. Keep that in mind. At the end of the day, it is justified and it's a mechanism in order to produce equality at the end of the day. Now, just to illustrate that even a second longer, I'd like to point out the fact that under this institution, under this framework, justice as fairness is to be fair and impartial point of view. It's our reasoning about fundamental principles. Our entire point is that we want greater equality. Once again, not because people are equal, they clearly aren't. But we're equal in terms of our right to make the most of attributes, dreams, and hopes we have. Equality allows people to express their unique voice. Now, number two, AI elite argument is answered by our de-alienation argument. Once again, just to illustrate this a little further, I like to point out that under this card or under this code, I talked about alienation is not understood as a naturalistic or essentialistic sense. Basically, those alienated mark the anchor points of capital with respect to the wage, especially in this digital economy. Our entire point is that UBI is the most suitable mechanism in terms of favoring the widest deployment of freedom of decision making. Given even what AI elites are saying, or what Elon Musk is saying, or whoever is saying it, we already answered it, and it's not specifically what we're advocating for. And number three, UBI solves specific harms of AI displacement and preserves human dignity. Human dignity today, Judge. That's been a big central point of this debate. And for all of these reasons, we urge an ask ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes. Yeah.
Judge, there's almost no clash on our case, which means that if you buy our framing, you automatically flow neck. Here's why our framing of a cost-benefit analysis should be preferred over their ideal of justice in the idealized state. First, they are twisting the words of the resolution. Societies should implement a UBI is often interpreted through the lens of solvency. The idea that a proposal must actually be capable of solving the problem it identifies. Engaging with feasibility isn't just being a buzzkill, it is the ethical and logical foundation of a productive argument. Debate exists to educate everyone, and if we don't combat with the idea of feasibility or whether something can actually happen, then we have no idea. We're not educated on our current world and the world that we live in. Without it, a debate ceases to be about a policy and becomes just a competition of fan fiction who has the better writing capabilities. Their only justification about the paradigm of a utopia is that debate should work towards an ideal society. Sure, we agree, but that requires us to look at the current societies we live in, not some idealized version of them. We have to clash with the idea of feasibility. Every dollar or hour spent on a non-feasible plan, which is what they're proposing, is a theft from a plan that might actually work. This is the opportunity cost of a bad policy and looking at an idealized state. Implementing a plan without considering political feasibility, economic feasibility, or like anything other or any other social social consequences leads to like a snapback effect where when the policy inevitably shows that it's bad, it's repealed, leaving the situation much worse than it was before. Basically, their case in a nutshell is that we should fix poverty in America. Yes, obviously, but we're saying that that will happen in our state, which doesn't implement policy under this Rawlsian framework of justice or veil of ignorance. We say that their case functions most fairly in and around as UBI shifts the philosophy of our nation, but not that the philosophy is taken before the UBI is implemented. So basically their framing for the round pretty much brackets out every single negative team and is uniquely uneducational because their lens for the round is completely utopic, which is fine to like an extent, but they're allowed to use framing to say how we should weigh impacts, but it isn't a way to functionally fiat a policy plan. They're absolutely abusing the word should in the resolution. The way it is functioning is that we should get a UBI plan, but it doesn't tell us anything about how the UBI is implemented. Why is this interpretation uniquely fair? Well, basically the AF case boils down to poverty in America is bad, and since bad things are bad, we should just stop them. Of course, we should do the things that are best for our state, but it is also very clear that many countries don't make policy with this philosophy in the background because they also have to consider the like possible consequences. We have somewhat of a dysfunctional state because people make policy without Rawlsian justice, and the most fair interpretation of their framework is that once UBI is implemented, it pushes Americans to thinking about the world in a more justice-based way. But when they bracket all of our offense out with their framing, they are technically saying that the policy gets implemented in its most uniquely utopian way, or that policymakers become John Rawls before implementing UBI. Judge, do a gut check. The AF cannot just say should, which means that we get all of the best things. We should have, this leaves the neg with nothing. They genuinely have to engage with feasibility of plans. Look specifically to our tech elitism contention, which discusses how those implementing UBI are the same tech giants creating the wealth inequality our opponents claim to hate. Those that want UBI don't want it for the right reasons. They discuss this is a huge issue because our entire case revolves around the fact that UBI doesn't get implemented how it should. There won't be a progressive wealth tax, or all of our evidence talks about regressive funding because that's how UBI actually evolves. Now let's go on to case, now that we gave you like all of the reasons why you should actually prefer a cost-benefit analysis. You will be placing your ballot for the neg on technological elitism every single time because any step towards implementing a UBI program means accepting that displacement is inevitable and protest is useless. It treats job losses as a fixed and unmovable point in the future rather than something that can be changed through good policy. UBI assumes that questions on regulating AI, slowing harmful automation, or redesigning systems are already settled and shoved under the mat, which is really terrible because it completely negates any form of democracy regarding the way people live their lives. It also further reinforces elitist power because workers are no longer encouraged to resist this power or organize against labor replacement because the system tells them it's pointless to do so. This means that it makes UBI in response to AI automation a unique trigger to elite power, which is really bad because they control the AI systems and retain full power while the public is shunned into the sidelines of shaping economic structure. This means that power is not redistributed, it is stabilized and reinforced in the hands of the wealthy. Also, look to our point about the global south and north divide. If we do genuinely go with our idea about this idealized state, what that means is that we're only going to be seeing an idealized state in the places where AI companies are actually happening. This is the US, this is the EU, this is wealthy nations. Why does that happen? Because they are the ones that actually have the capacity to improve AI and innovate, and that means that the poorer countries in the global south, South America, Brazil, they're going to have to either label data and just mine raw materials, which means that because UBI is a domestic policy, they're not seeing any of the benefits. So what if we do genuinely go with this utopia in America and all the Western nations, we're going to be completely bracketing out all of the people that are living in these other countries, which is uniquely really bad because that means that we're not seeing any improvement in societies overall, which is what they're trying to talk about. Now let's go specifically down the case. First, they're talking about social security. Again, they dropped that social welfare inherently already provides more money than what UBI was. It provides almost double the amount that people would get yearly. They also don't respond to our thing about people not working because they don't they just will stop working, which is uniquely really bad for the economy because there won't be a lot of production going on. So for all of these reasons, prefer our cost benefit analysis and the fact that we don't live in an ideal society.
Thank you.